Somewhere in the lands between right now, a thing with a gold crown and too many arms is dragging itself out of the dirt. Somewhere else, a creature that used to be a person is hanging from a ceiling, waiting to die. Somewhere else again, a star that the universe itself rejected is dreaming in the dark underground, growing mandibles it will never need for anything except violence. Elden Ring is often called the most beautiful game from software has ever made, and it is. But that beauty was always a kind of camouflage, because underneath it is some of the most disturbing design work this genre has ever produced, and almost none of it is disturbing by accident. Every one of these things has a history. Every one of them was made this way by something. Tonight we are going to sit with 14 of them, not to rank them, not to decide which is worst, but to actually understand them, the way you would want to be understood if you had been the one turned into a nightmare. You do not have to hold any of this tightly. This is a long, slow telling, built for the kind of night where you would rather listen than watch. If your eyes close before we reach the end, that is not losing the thread. That is exactly what this was built for. Let your body settle into wherever it is right now. Let the room hold you. We will start with a crown. In the misty water of Liurnia, past a place called Lashia Ruins, there is a small shrine with a strange portal in it. Walk close enough, and something erupts out of the ground directly through that portal, a mass of limbs and stretched skin that should not be able to move as fast as it does. Once it is fully out of the earth, you can see what it actually is, and the shape of it takes a moment to parse. There is no normal torso. Instead, a single set of reversed legs acts as a base, and from that base, several torsos branch upward and outward at once, each one sprouting its own long, pale arms with elongated fingers. There is a tumor of an arm growing directly out of its back for no reason a body should need. If you had to describe the silhouette in plain language, it is something like a spider made out of a person, low to the ground, asymmetrical, its face tucked into a dark hood, its lower half hollowed out as though the bottom of it simply rotted away. And on top of all of that, a gold crown set with jewels that's sitting undisturbed on a head that should not still exist. The easy assumption is that this is another victim of grafting, the same crude process that made Godric's scions, bodies stitched together out of other bodies. But look closely, and the assumption falls apart. Grafted things show their seams. You can see the mismatched skin tones, the raw stitching, the places where one body was forced onto another. The Royal Revenant has none of that. Its limbs share one uniform, sickly pale skin with no seams anywhere. Nothing here was attached. It grew this way, the way a tree grows extra branches rather than having them nailed on. The sound it makes tells you something too. It screams like it is struggling to force the sound out of a throat that does not want to cooperate. It rushes you in a panic of wild slaps and spit poison, and even running does nothing, because it can slip into the ground and reappear beside you, cutting off the escape before you have finished deciding to take it. That teleportation is not a random power. These things are closely tied to an enemy type called Wraith Callers, and Wraiths in this world are specifically the vengeful spirits of people who died while cursed. The Revenant seems to operate partway as a spirit itself, phasing briefly into some other plane before returning to the physical world close enough to end your retreat. The poison it spits is worth sitting with too, because in this world, poison is almost never a weapon someone chose. It is what deep stagnation and rot look like when a body cannot process them. With its abdomen hollowed out and its remains trapped in forgotten underground ruins, the Revenant is rotting continuously from the inside, and the toxic sludge it spits at you during the fight reads less like an attack it decided on and more like something it cannot stop itself from doing. A reflex, a body purging what it cannot hold. Then there's the name, A revenant, by definition, is something that has returned from the dead. But why royal? Besides the crown, look at the tattered clothing draped over the body. There are no faction crests, no house symbols, but the fabric carries an unmistakable gold tint, and in the lands between, gold belongs to one thing only: the Erd Tree and the order built beneath it. That tint strongly implies these were once people of high standing, tied to the golden aristocracy before whatever happened to them happened. And they are not found wandering at random. They appear in specific, lore heavy locations: ruins tied to old kingdoms, hidden estates, and the roads leading toward the Halictree, which suggests a theory the community has circled for a long time: that these are the cursed remains of nobility who tried to flee the Golden Order's strict rule in search of the one place that might have taken them in and never made it. They died somewhere on that road, and this is what came back in their place. The shadow of the Erd Tree expansion strengthens that connection to death even further. There is an encounter with an ancient entity tied to the very roots of death, capable of summoning a Royal Revenant to fight beside it, which all but confirms these creatures carry a foundational connection to something older than an ordinary curse. There is one more detail worth knowing, because it says something about how deliberately built this creature's suffering really is. Players have found that a simple area of effect healing spell, the kind meant to restore and comfort, can devastate or even instantly destroy a Royal Revenant. A heal spell acting like a bomb sounds like a bug, but it fits the lore precisely. If a Revenant is a mass of flesh only barely holding its shape together through corruption, then flooding it with pure restorative magic forces its body to try to correct itself back toward its original human form, all at once, violently, and tearing the wrong kind of structure apart from the inside. And interestingly, these things are naturally resistant to holy damage, which is the signature power of the Golden Order. Because they were once nobles, living under that order's authority, some trace of that protection lingers in them, even as gentler magic destroys what the order's own violence never finished. They were made noble, they were made cursed, and now the only mercy anyone can offer them accidentally kills them. There is a stillness to where they wait that makes the first encounter worse than it needs to be. You do not typically see a Royal Revenant coming. You see the shrine, the portal, the quiet, and by the time your eyes have finished adjusting to the fog, it has already closed half the distance between you. That specific pattern, calm scenery giving way instantly to violence with almost no transition, repeats itself throughout this world more than any single jump scare ever could, and the Revenant is one of its clearest examples. Beauty is never a promise of safety here. It is, if anything, the opposite, a signal that whatever comes next has been waiting long enough to get good at surprising you. Notice, too, how much of what makes this creature disturbing has nothing to do with what it does to you and everything to do with what it clearly did to itself, or had done to it, long before you ever arrived. You are not the author of its suffering. You are only the latest thing to walk close enough to witness it. That distinction matters more than it might seem to at first. Most of tonight's telling is going to ask you to hold exactly that same distinction, again and again, the difference between a threat and a wound that simply happens to be capable of reaching you. Consider, too, how strange it is that a body this thoroughly ruined can still move as fast as it does. There is no gentle stagger here, no slow, lurching gait the way decayed creatures are often written elsewhere. Whatever animates the Royal Revenant clearly does not require an intact, functional body to move with real, dangerous speed, which raises an uncomfortable question all its own. If ordinary decay does not slow it down, then whatever is actually driving that body forward is not physical stamina at all. It might simply be will, or grief, or rage, refusing on some fundamental level to lie down, regardless of how little is structurally left to carry it. You're still here. Good. Let's go a little further underground. Deep beneath Liurnia, in the dark, there is something that fell out of the sky and never should have landed anywhere near people. When you first meet it, the shock is almost entirely about its silhouette, an unnatural blend of insect and human that your eyes do not want to resolve. Massive black mandibles jut out from its face, resembling the crushing jaws of a stag beetle, clicking together with a hollow, mechanical sound whenever it is at rest. Most people who are unsettled by insects are not actually afraid of beetles specifically, since beetles are rarely dangerous to a person. This is not that kind of beetle. Those mandibles deal real, brutal damage, and they were never there just to look intimidating. The rest of the body keeps building on the wrongness. It resembles something like a great dragonfly, a long, segmented spine formed out of a procession of multicolored orbs and starry debris held together by thin, flowing rings that look almost exactly like the rings of a planet. Four translucent wings to suspend it in place. Its tail is lined with spikes and ends in a stinger it wields like a scorpion. And behind those crushing beetle jaws, tucked inside, there is a disturbingly realistic human skull, complete with a nose cavity, eye sockets, and ordinary human teeth. Not predator's teeth, regular ones, the kind meant for chewing rather than tearing, which suggests something specific about how it actually eats. The mandibles are for catching and cutting prey down to a manageable size. The human teeth are for what comes after, chewing the remains into something small enough to swallow. Partway through the fight, that skull tears open to reveal what is actually underneath. A massive central eye swelling with cosmic color, an iris and pupil that genuinely move. If you pull the model apart with outside tools, that eye ends up looking remarkably like a plant. It might not simply be an eye. It might be a raw fragment of the cosmos itself, still doing something like growing. The English name given to this creature is natural born of the void, which implies something pure and intended, an elemental force doing exactly what the universe designed it to do. But the original Japanese name translates far more bluntly to something like illegitimate child of the void or bastard of the void. A natural born thing is wanted, an illegitimate one is not. The cosmos, in this reading, did not send this creature to the lands between on purpose. It expelled it, the same way a body expels something it does not want inside it anymore. In an earlier build of the game, this creature was named differently still, Misbegotten of the Void, and the terrestrial enemies known as Misbegotten were at that stage internally labeled as aberrations. In the world's own theology, the Misbegotten are a shunned, enslaved people, viewed as impure mistakes who fall outside the Erd Tree's grace. If the naming was ever this close, the implication is uncomfortable and clear. Just as the ground below rejects its mutated and unwanted, the cosmos above rejected this thing too. It is a deformed offspring of the dark, cast out by something even larger than the world it landed in. When it landed, it brought ruin with it. Item descriptions state plainly that its arrival destroyed an entire eternal city and stripped away the false sky that once covered it. It still wields the gravitational force that brought it down, firing beams of that power from its own mouth and warping the space around it during a fight. There is a life cycle hiding underneath all of this that most players never fully piece together. If you explore the overworld, you will eventually run into something called a falling star beast, sitting inside a fresh impact crater, having crash-landed the exact same way. Set one beside the other, and the resemblance stops being subtle. Both possess the same long black mandibles. Both grow a heavy, weaponized tail that thickens and sharpens with age, eventually matching the scorpion tail seen fully grown. Both share an affinity for gravity magic in varying strength. The young beasts lack a visible eye, but the fully matured ones develop the same large centralized eye that sits behind the mature creature's skull, And if you look closely at a mature falling star beast just beneath that eye, you can make out the faint outline of a facial structure hidden under a thick layer of fur, the same skull waiting to be revealed later. The likely real world inspiration is an insect called the ant lion. In its larval stage, an antlion digs a small pit in the sand, sometimes called a death pit, to trap and consume passing prey, and its stubby body and prominent mandibles look remarkably like a falling star beast curled inside its crater. Once it is consumed enough, it undergoes a complete transformation, shedding its stubby form for an elongated winged shape, an antlion lacewing. That is the exact progression a falling star beast follows as it matures in the dark underground, eventually becoming the thin, spindled, iridescent creature we are looking at right now. The life cycle does not stop at maturity either, because the game shows us its ending too. This first form is the prime example, still young enough to be dangerous in the fullest sense. Elsewhere, hidden in a frozen cavern, there is a second variant, functionally similar but able to summon clones of itself to disorient anyone fighting it. And in various underground depths, you can find much smaller, unnamed versions hanging from ceilings, sharing the same body but looking withered and diminished. Old guidebooks refer to these hanging ones with a term that translates to withered, the same word used to describe a plant that is actively dying. These are simply mature creatures that have reached the end of their lifespan, their gravity magic failing, their mobility gone, quietly waiting in the dark to die and return to whatever they came from. The looming threat of more of these things crashing into the world is, according to the lore, the entire reason a certain general once conquered the stars, halting their movement specifically to stop any more falling star beasts and fully grown cosmic horrors from raining down onto the lands between. Hidden in the game's unused data is a fully animated sequence of this creature falling from the sky and crashing into the earth like a living meteor, using the exact same visual effects as that general's own signature meteor attack. Many in the community believe this was meant to connect the two more directly at some point in development. One crisis handed off from a falling star to the man who stopped it before the idea was reworked into two separate fights. It is a body built by loss twice over, rejected by the cosmos that made it, and killed by the exact power that was raised specifically to keep more of it from ever landing. There is something worth sitting with in the sheer scale of the arena it fights you in, a cavern large enough to genuinely hold something that fell out of the sky. Most bosses in this world feel large because the game frames them that way. Careful camera work, dramatic entrances. Astel simply is large, in a way the space around it has to physically accommodate, and that unglamorous structural kind of scale is somehow more unsettling than any amount of directed spectacle could manage. You are not being shown something impressive. You are standing next to something that genuinely, physically, does not belong on this planet, in a hole in the ground that had to be that big only because nothing smaller could have contained it. Come back to the sound of my voice for a moment. We are staying underground. Elden Ring tells most of its story through item descriptions, a line of text attached to a ring or a robe that quietly reveals who someone used to be. But some enemies in this game receive none of that. No items, no dialogue, no single confirmed sentence anywhere in the text explaining what they are. When that happens, their history has to be built entirely from where they stand, how they behave, and what the game's internal files happen to call them, and that is exactly the situation with the creatures commonly known as Wormfaces. Seen from a distance in the Altus Plateau, they look like towering, grotesque figures wrapped in filthy, discolored cloth. Get closer, and their most prominent feature becomes clear, a cluster of writhing organisms protruding from the front of the head, moving on their own. Beneath that infestation, the character model reveals something with a clearly defined, elongated human head, skin mottled and pockmarked, human ears still present on the sides of the skull. The limbs, though stretched to proportions no human body should reach, end in fully formed human hands and feet. Whatever these creatures actually are, the evidence underneath the worms points to something that used to be, unmistakably, a person. The sound design confirms it in a way that is somehow worse than any visual detail. Worm faces do not roar. They cough, violently, exactly the way a sick person expels fluid from their chest. Left undisturbed, they can be heard weeping, muttering something close to speech, as though attempting to pray or curse at someone who is not there. Even their laughter comes out mournful. This points toward a genuinely upsetting possibility that whatever is inside these things is still self aware, still fully conscious of what has happened to it, and still suffering because of it. The internal name the developers gave these creatures translates from French to something like uprooted, and uprooting is exactly what these things do to survive, both literally and structurally. In this world, the roots of the Erd tree function as a kind of enormous graveyard. The faithful bury their dead in those roots, so their souls can eventually be reborn into grace. Somewhere far below, a demigod's cursed body lies buried in that same root system, and its presence poisons everything nearby with a death curse. Wormfaces may have dug into that poisoned earth and fed on what they found there, or the corruption may have simply found them regardless. Either way, it likely explains the death-tainted breath they attack with. They gather in force near minor Erd trees, acting less like random monsters and more like guardians, to the point that a massive wormface variant stands in for what would normally be an Erd tree avatar boss. The items scattered near their territory carry unmistakable Golden Order associations, incantations, and ashes of war tied directly to that faith. Their combat behavior lines up too. Heavy resistance to holy damage, but real vulnerability to slashing, the kind of damage that specifically affects creatures who still bleed the way a human bleeds. Taken together, all of it points toward the same origin, that these were once priests, monks, or deeply devoted followers of the Golden Order, left behind and slowly transformed when the order they served collapsed and abandoned them along with it. A separate population of wormfaces exists far away from Altus entirely, inside the ruined, storm-suspended city of Farum Azula, and this group looks different, wrapped in cleaner fabric, wearing medallions that suggest a different status or origin entirely. Their presence there is strange, since that city is disconnected from the rest of the lands between by more than just distance. One likely explanation involves a figure who resides in that city, someone who quietly harvests a rare and corrupting resource from the world below and unknowingly carries traces of it home with him each time he returns. If that resource is the same thing feeding the corruption seen elsewhere, then this figure may have introduced the same curse to Farum Azula without ever intending to. There is also a visual clue that complicates the simple explanation. Inside one boss arena in that same ruined city, ancient carved murals depict tall, slender figures with elongated cloth-wrapped heads, and crucially, none of them have worms on their faces. That suggests the long-necked form seen in the murals may have been an original, natural shape for whoever these beings were, long before any corruption reached them, meaning the population in Farum Azula might not be visitors from elsewhere at all, but the actual point of origin, with the population found on the surface being descendants who fell, fled, or were exiled from that same city long ago, only to find the same curse waiting in the roots they eventually settled near. Two more details are worth sitting with before we move on. Inside the game's own files, every ordinary wormface is labeled male, carrying sticks, traveling in packs, their mouths empty beneath the worms. The larger, boss-sized variants are labeled female, wearing a delicate off-white lace shawl and carrying a second cluster of worms actively moving inside an open mouth. This gender divide closely mirrors the structure of certain insect colonies, where the female functions as a kind of matriarch, larger, central, and responsible for sustaining the group, while the smaller males act as expendable defenders, patrolling the perimeter, dying easily, their infected bodies simply returning the death curse to the soil when they fall. Even the shawl worn by the matriarch hints at a previous life of higher standing, perhaps a priestess, before any of this happened to her. The very last detail is almost a cruelty in itself. Near a withered minor erd tree in one particular region, there is what appears to be a frail, harmless figure sitting quietly by a fire. Kill it, and it instantly transforms into a massive, aggressive female worm face. It was never that figure at all, but a mimic creature, one that survives in the wild by copying the deadliest apex predator nearby. In that specific corrupted region, the deadliest thing around is a worm-faced matriarch, which tells you plainly and without any text at all exactly how dangerous this world considers them to be. There is something worth naming about how the worm faces move as a group, because it is easy to miss while you are busy surviving the encounter. The males do not simply defend a fixed point. They patrol in loose, overlapping routes, the way a community with an actual sense of shared territory would organize itself, rather than the way most hostile enemies in this world simply wait to be triggered. It is one of the few pieces of behavioral evidence, alongside everything else, suggesting that whatever intelligence survived inside them was not entirely erased by the corruption. Something in there still remembers how to work together. It has simply forgotten or lost the ability to explain why. The absence of any confirming text here is, in its own strange way, the most honest thing this world could have done with them. Not every tragedy gets a witness. Not every suffering gets recorded, cataloged, and preserved in a neat item description for someone centuries later to find and finally understand. Most grief, historically, in this world and in ours simply happens, unrecorded, to people no one thought important enough to write down, and the worm faces might be the closest thing Elden Ring has to an honest monument for exactly that kind of forgotten, undocumented suffering. Let your shoulders drop a little. There is a gentler kind of horror waiting in the next chapter, one built almost entirely out of grief. On their own, the Albinaurics are not built to be frightening. Their horror comes almost entirely from what has been done to them and why, which somehow makes it worse rather than easier to sit with. Old alchemical theory divided life into three essential parts: salt as the solid body, mercury as the fluid, and sulfur as the spirit or soul. The Albinaurics are heavily associated with silver and mercury specifically. The blue-silver armor worn by their archers is explicitly described as forged from the same source as the archers themselves, and when struck, they bleed silver rather than red. They have the salt and the mercury needed to build a body and a mind, but because they were created artificially rather than born, the Golden Order believes they are missing the third piece, the sulfur, the soul. In that theology, they are considered unnatural, life without the one ingredient that would make it legitimate. That artificial origin left visible flaws splitting their evolutionary line into two failed attempts. The first generation has proportionate humanoid features, but their legs simply fade away into nothing over time, forcing them to crawl or ride wolves just to move. Within that same generation, the young combat-capable archers are exclusively female, while the older, fading villagers are male, an arrangement that looks like a failed attempt to recreate the divine duality of the world's two central god figures. The second generation was built to correct that first flaw. It succeeded, engineering fully functional legs that let these beings walk, jump, and move freely. But the fix came at a cost, leaving them with heavy, malformed heads and no ability to speak at all. They may be the closest thing this world has to true synthetic humans, and the question underneath everything about them is simple. Why are they so universally hated? The answer comes down to one uncompromising belief. They are life made by human hands rather than grown from the Erd tree's grace, and because of that, the faithful consider them impure by definition, regardless of anything they actually do. And yet, despite bleeding silver instead of red, despite existing entirely outside the natural cycle everyone else was born into, they express fear. They build tight communities. They care for their own dead. None of that changes how the Golden Order treats them, because to the truly devoted, if you were not touched by grace, you are considered nothing at all. That hatred runs all the way down through the world's factions, most visibly through knights who hunt Albinaurics for sport, treating their silver blood as something defiled rather than simply different. Their remains are even processed into a usable item, a clear demonstration of exactly how disposable they are considered to be. It is worth naming plainly what this pattern resembles, because the game is not subtle about it. Authoritarian systems throughout human history have relied on exactly this kind of scapegoat, an outgroup labeled subhuman, to unite everyone else in fear and shared hatred, keeping anger pointed downward at the powerless rather than upward at the people actually in charge. The Golden Order's obsession with grace echoes that same pattern closely enough that it cannot be a coincidence. The ones touched by the tree are valid. The ones who are not, like the Albinaurics, are officially classified as abominations, and everything that follows from that classification follows the same old ugly logic. The deeper question is who actually created them in the first place. The clearest evidence points underground to a faction obsessed with forbidden experimentation in pursuit of a very specific, very dark goal. Albinaurics share an undeniable material origin with certain silver-blooded creatures found deep below the surface, both relying on the same strange liquid metal. It seems likely the Albinaurics began as an attempt to refine that raw material into something closer to an independent functioning race. From there, other powers on the surface appear to have taken that underground research and continued it themselves, likely to produce a disposable workforce, which would explain why Albinaurics turn up guarding certain academies and estates as expendable labor. That disregard for their lives reaches its cruelest point in the massacre of an entire Albinauric village, discovered as a scene of burning bodies and figures strung from bridges, carried out by a supposedly all-knowing hermit and his enforcers over something as small as half of a medallion leading toward a hidden, sacred region. That same medallion connects directly to why one particular Albinauric woman is being so relentlessly hunted throughout the story, because she holds the knowledge of a hidden path to a sanctuary built specifically for outcasts like her. That sanctuary exists because of a promise. A particular Empyrean, one who spent his whole life trying to heal his own afflicted sister, built a haven meant for everyone the Erdtree's grace had ever rejected, the misbegotten, the omens, and the Albinaurics among them. For a people who had only ever known experimentation, persecution, and slaughter, that promise was the only real hope they had ever been offered. It mattered enough that a former knight of noble standing personally carved a safe path to reach it, and it mattered enough that certain Albinauric archers still defend that path with everything they have. The story eventually asks one final, quietly devastating question. Are Albinaurics capable of reproducing on their own, or will they always depend on someone else's hands to be created? For most of their history, the answer was the second one, entirely dependent on outside creation. But near the end of one particular questline, a mysterious substance referred to only as a birthing droplet is delivered to a towering, first-generation matriarch, an attempt to grant her people for the first time the biological ability to continue on their own terms. It is one of the only truly hopeful moments in this entire story. After generations of torture and slaughter for the crime of being made rather than born, they no longer need permission from the order that despised them or the scientists who built them to keep existing. For once, something about their fate belongs entirely to them. It is worth noticing, too, how differently the two Albinauric generations are treated even within their own community. The first generation, fading and legless, are cared for rather than discarded, carried, protected, kept close by the very archers who could otherwise be out defending the wider group. There is no text confirming why exactly, but the behavior alone tells you something. A people constantly told by the world outside that they are not truly alive seem to have built, among themselves, an unusually careful answer to that accusation, treating even their most diminished members as worth the trouble of keeping. Whatever the Golden Order decided they were missing, it does not appear to be tenderness. It is worth sitting, too, with how the second generation's inability to speak reshapes everything about how they are able to be understood by anyone outside their own community. A being that cannot explain itself is a being the rest of the world gets to define entirely on its own terms, and the terms the Golden Order chose were never generous. Silence in this world, as in most others, tends to get filled in by whoever is doing the looking, and the Albinaurics have spent their entire existence having their silence filled in by people who had already decided, long before any individual Albinauric ever did anything at all, exactly what that silence was supposed to mean. Their name itself is worth a final moment, borrowed loosely from a real-world term, describing a lack of pigmentation, the pale, colorless quality of skin or hair. Applied here, it becomes almost clinical, a label describing a visible trait rather than a person, the same way a species might be named for a physical feature rather than for anything it believes or wants or fears. That clinical distance is, in its own quiet way, part of the cruelty. It is difficult to fully see someone as a person while you are still calling them primarily by a word that describes what color they happen not to be. Good. Let the sadness of that one settle for a moment before we move again. What comes next is colder. Among the disciples of the Fell God, a being defined almost entirely by ending things, the Godskin sect stands out as some of the most disturbing believers in the entire world, and the reason is written plainly into their own name. Their robes and vestments are not fabric at all. They are skin, flayed from the sect's earliest followers and worn as sacred clothing, a literal, physical devotion rather than a symbolic one. To become closer to their god, the earliest members of this order stripped themselves and each other, believing that shedding the flesh was a step towards something higher than an ordinary human body was capable of holding. What remains, walking through ruins and catacombs, are their successors, wrapped in that same practice, still carrying it forward. They appear in two distinct forms that almost always work together. The Apostle wields black flame, a fire specifically capable of burning away a soul rather than simply burning flesh, along with dark, corrupting magic that spreads and lingers. The noble fights physically, using a long, whip-like limb in place of an arm, striking from unnatural distance and unnatural angles. Fought together as they usually are, the pairing feels less like two separate enemies and more like two expressions of a single devoted purpose. Both share something that makes them especially difficult to think about as simply dead once you have defeated them. They can consume themselves in their own black flame and be reborn from the ash mid-fight, restored, continuing exactly where they left off. This is not framed as a survival trick. It reads as doctrine, sacrifice as a form of rebirth, destruction treated as a beginning rather than an end. Their devotion to their fell god is expressed by demonstrating again and again, that they are willing to be destroyed for it, and that destruction costs them nothing they consider permanent. It is worth remembering that this fell god they serve is one of several outer gods scattered through this world's cosmology, forces from entirely outside the world that occasionally find footholds within it through willing followers. Where other outer gods offer power, or rot, or frenzy, the fell god's promise seems to be closer to conclusion itself, the idea that everything eventually deserves to burn all the way down. The Godskin sect exists to hasten that ending, one flayed vestment and one self-immolation at a time, and their belief in what they are doing never once wavers, no matter how many times the fight forces them to prove it. The weapons this sect leaves behind carry their own quiet confirmation of all of this. A tool called the Godskin Peeler is described plainly as an instrument for flaying, used by the sect to harvest the very skin its members would go on to wear, and a second, heavier weapon called the Godskin Stitcher continues that same grim logic, meant less for ordinary combat than for the preparation of a body for what would eventually be worn. There is nothing metaphorical in these descriptions. The sect's most sacred garments began as an act of violence performed on someone, sometimes willingly, sometimes very likely not, and the finished vestment carries that violence forward every time it is worn again. Their black flame deserves a moment of its own, too, because of what it specifically ignores. Most fire in this world burns flesh. This flame burns further than that, into whatever it is that death normally cannot reach, which is why creatures, and even certain undying figures who shrug off ordinary death, find the Godskin's fire genuinely dangerous. It does not simply kill, it unmakes the part of you that would otherwise come back. Choosing that particular flame as your order's signature weapon is itself a statement of belief, a declaration that ordinary death is not final enough. The true devotion requires something willing to burn all the way through to the end of a person and stop there. There is a version of this that is almost sympathetic if you tilt your head at the right angle. A community bound so tightly by shared belief that its members offer their own skin as proof of loyalty over and over, without complaint, without hesitation, right up until the last one standing simply keeps doing it alone. Devotion this total rarely looks healthy from the outside. It rarely feels like anything the person inside it would call suffering either. That gap between how a thing looks to the people watching and how it feels to the person inside it is where most of this sect's horror actually lives. There is a particular figure connected to this sect worth naming, a beast clergyman found in a shunned corner of the world, kept in isolation by his own people for a hunger he was born with and could never fully master. His story does not belong to the Godskins directly, but the shape of it rhymes with theirs closely enough to be worth holding side by side. A body that betrays the mind wearing it. A community that responds to that betrayal with confinement rather than cruelty, which is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of sentence. The Godskins chose their transformation. He did not choose his. And yet both stories land in roughly the same place. A person made into something the world finds difficult to look at directly, still carrying, somewhere underneath all of it, whatever part of them used to be simply a person with wants of their own. You find Godskin followers scattered across some of the world's oldest, most abandoned architecture, catacombs, sealed tunnels, the kind of places built specifically to be forgotten. That placement is not incidental either. A faith devoted to hastening and ending naturally gravitates toward the places the rest of the world has already, functionally ended. They are not hiding from anyone. There is nothing left in those spaces worth hiding from. They are simply where a religion built around conclusion would logically choose to wait, undisturbed, for as long as it takes. There is one more detail worth carrying out of this chapter, easy to miss the first time through. Godskin followers are never found completely alone in the wider world the way some of tonight's other creatures are. They travel in relation to each other, apostle near noble, one expression of the faith rarely far from its counterpart. Even a religion that's committed to ending things still seems to require company to actually carry that ending out. A small, telling admission that even total devotion to conclusion could not quite manage to be a solitary practice. You made it to the next chapter. There is one more layer of the world's own theology waiting here, wearing a much stranger face. Some of what makes this world unsettling is not what the text confirms. It is what the text refuses to say at all, and few creatures demonstrate that better than the crawling, severed hands found deep in Raya Lucaria's basement and in the hidden reaches of Volcano Manor. Visually, there is very little ambiguity about what you are looking at. A hand, oversized, detached, fingers splayed wide, crawling and lunging with a speed that a hand should never have. No documented history exists anywhere in the game's text explaining where they came from or why they exist in these two specific, very different locations. What we are left with instead is pure suggestion, and in this world, the most powerful ongoing suggestion involving hands is impossible to ignore. Fingers in the lands between are sacred. The two fingers and the three fingers are the literal instruments through which higher powers select an Empyrean, reach into the world, and shape fate itself. A hand in this theology is not a body part. It is a conduit, the physical point where something enormous chooses to touch the world of ordinary people. Against that backdrop, a severed hand crawling alone in the dark, hostile, feral, stripped of any larger body to belong to, reads less like a random monster design and more like a corruption of that same sacred image, a mockery or perhaps a warning about what contact with that kind of power can do when it happens without permission, without ceremony, without anything sacred attached to it at all. The game gives us almost nothing else to work with here, and that silence is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Not every horror in this world comes with an explanation. Some of it is left in the dark, specifically, so you have to sit there wondering exactly how close you came to something you were never meant to understand. What we do have is location, and location in this world is rarely accidental. One nest of these things waits in the depths of Volcano Manor, a place built entirely around quiet cruelty, where guests are lured in, questioned, and made to disappear by hosts who present themselves as gracious right up until the moment they are not. The other waits beneath Raya Lucaria, in the flooded lower reaches of an academy devoted to sorcery, to controlled and disciplined study of forces most people are never permitted to touch. Two very different institutions, joined by the same crawling thing living underneath both of them, as though whatever produced these hands does not particularly care what kind of power is practiced above it, only that power of some kind is being practiced at all. There is something specifically uncomfortable about a hand as the shape chosen for a monster, more than almost any other body part could manage. A hand is how a person touches someone gently. It is how you hold on to someone you love, how you reach out to help someone up, how comfort is physically delivered from one body to another. Watching that exact shape detached, enlarged, and turned into something that only exists to grab and to hurt feels like a small, specific betrayal, a familiar gesture wearing a completely wrong intention. Whether that was intentional on the part of whoever designed it, or simply an unavoidable consequence of building a monster out of the one shape every player instinctively trusts, the result lands the same way either time. Something meant to hold you gently is instead reaching for you in the dark, and your body flinches before your mind has finished deciding why. There is a version of the same discomfort built into the game's own combat systems, worth noticing once you know to look for it. Grasping, gripping, reaching. These are gestures the game usually reserves for the player character's own hands, the ones you use to pick up a fallen weapon, to embrace an ally, to touch grace itself at a site of rest. Watching that same fundamental gesture, touch's connection, weaponized and turned feral, forces an uncomfortable kind of recognition. The monster is not doing something alien to you. It is doing the one thing your own hands do constantly, just entirely stripped of any of the intention that usually makes it feel safe. There is a second, quieter reading worth holding alongside the first. In academies and manors, real power is rarely wielded by the person whose name is on the door. It moves through hands, servants, agents, the ones who do the actual reaching on someone else's behalf, while the person in charge stays clean, stays gracious, stays upstairs. A crawling, disembodied hand, doing violent work alone in the dark, while whoever sent it remains entirely out of sight, might be the most literal possible image this game has ever produced for exactly that kind of arrangement. Watch one for long enough, and its movement stops reading as animalistic and starts reading as something closer to searching. It does not simply lunge and retreat the way a startled creature would. It drags itself forward with a kind of methodical persistence, fingers finding grip on stone that should offer none, as though it is not hunting so much as feeling its way toward something specific it has been reaching for the entire time anyone has ever seen it. What that something is, the game never says. It may not even be a thing at all. It may simply be the shape searching has taken, permanently, in a hand that no longer has anywhere left to arrive. There is a theory that circulates often enough among longtime players to be worth mentioning here, carefully, as exactly what it is, a theory rather than a confirmed fact. Becoming an Emperor is not automatic. It requires being chosen, and the process of being examined and either accepted or rejected by that sacred touch is never shown to us directly. Some players wonder whether these crawling hands are what a rejection actually looks like made physical, a body that was reached for, found wanting, and discarded, the hand itself left behind, severed from whatever failed candidate it once belonged to, animated by nothing more than the last, lingering trace of a selection that never completed. The game gives us nothing to confirm this outright, but it fits the shape of everything else this world tends to do with its failures, discarding them somewhere dark, leaving them to keep moving long after anyone stopped intending them to. Settle back in, we are staying with the theme of guardians who have outlived what they were guarding. Scattered throughout the lands between, standing watch over the smaller, lesser Erd trees that dot the countryside, are guardians whose entire purpose was once protection, and whose current condition makes that purpose almost unbearable to witness. An ulcerated tree spirit rises out of the earth as an enormous trunk, its bark replaced almost entirely by clustered growths and open tumors, skeletal arms extending from where branches should be. Its head carries a heavy, elephantine shape, disproportionate and wrong in a way that takes a moment to fully register. It attacks with rot and poison, breathing corruption outward the same way a healthy tree might once have offered shade. These are not new creatures built specifically to be monstrous. They are corrupted versions of a much older, more familiar guardian, the kind of protector meant to stand over a minor Erd tree, the same way certain sentinels stand over the great one. Somewhere along the way, whatever they were meant to guard was abandoned, or corrupted, or simply forgotten by the wider world, and the guardian rotted right alongside it. There is no dramatic story attached to most of them individually. There does not need to be. Their entire design is the story, a duty that outlived its purpose, still being carried out by a body that has long since stopped being able to carry it out cleanly. It raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. What happens to devotion when the thing it was devoted to disappears? In most of this world's factions, devotion without its object curdles into something else entirely: grief, obsession, or in this specific case, slow physical rot. The ulcerated tree spirit never stops standing guard. It simply stands guard over less and less, decaying in place, faithful to a duty that no longer has anyone left to notice it. You meet smaller versions of this guardian in relatively populated places, the Weeping Peninsula, the fields around Stormhill, spots that still see travelers passing through even now. But the largest ones, the versions so overgrown they barely resemble a tree anymore, wait in the places furthest from anyone. Deep in the consecrated snowfield, far past where most people ever bother walking, and further still, coiled in the lightless dark of the deep root depths, below even the roots that other creatures in this story have already shown us, are a kind of graveyard in their own right. There is a pattern hiding in that placement once you notice it. The worse the rot, the further from anyone it tends to be, as though scale itself is just abandonment, measured out over a longer and longer stretch of forgotten time. Something else worth sitting with is how little malice actually seems to be involved anywhere in this. The ulcerated tree spirit is not hunting anyone. It is not driven by hunger or cruelty the way some of tonight's other creatures clearly are. It simply continues occupying the one patch of ground it was placed to protect, attacking anything that enters that space, the exact same behavior a healthy guardian would show, just performed now by a body that has been rotting for what was very likely centuries. Duty in this world does not appear to require a mind still capable of understanding why the duty exists. It only requires a body that has not yet finished collapsing, and this one evidently has not. There is a smaller, more common relative of this creature found guarding healthier minor erd trees elsewhere across the map. Still whole, still bark covered, still visibly a tree rather than a wound-wearing bark-shaped skin. Placing the two side by side is genuinely useful because it makes the corruption legible in a way words alone cannot quite manage. This is what devotion looks like when the thing being protected is still there to justify it. This is what the exact same devotion looks like several centuries after that justification quietly, unceremoniously disappeared. There's a strange kind of comfort hiding inside that too, if you are willing to look for it. Nothing about the ulcerated tree spirit is malicious. It never once seems to enjoy what it does. It is simply the last thing left standing in a place everyone else forgot, still doing the only job it has ever known, long after the audience for that job stopped existing. Grief carried out as routine for long enough that routine is all that remains of it. The sound it makes when it finally notices you is worth mentioning too. A deep, groaning creak, closer to old timber shifting under weight than to any animal cry, followed by a low, guttural roar that seems to come from somewhere much larger than the trunk it is escaping from. It is the sound of something that has forgotten how to be startled, responding to an intrusion the only way its body still remembers how, slow at first, and then, once it is finally moving, entirely unstoppable. There is no urgency in it until there suddenly, violently is. Look closely at the head once you have the chance, and the elephantine shape resolves into something stranger than it first appears. It is less a single head than a mass of thick, root-like growths bundled together into a roughly skull-shaped form, no discernible eyes, no discernible mouth beyond the wound-like opening it breathes rot through. There is nothing left here resembling a face, in the way even some of tonight's other creatures still carry the ghost of one. Whatever perceptual sense it uses to know you are standing in front of it clearly does not require anything a face would normally provide, which somehow makes the moment it does turn toward you even more unsettling than if it had simply been staring the entire time. Here we are again. What comes next, crossed over from the lands between into the shadow of the Erd tree itself. Deep within the shadow of the Erd Tree, in the territory surrounding the Shadow Keep, you encounter knights whose armor no longer holds together the way armor should. Instead of steel catching the light, their plating leaks and weeps, thick and wet, scarlet rot seeping visibly from every seam, every joint, every place where the metal should have stayed sealed. They move like knights still. They fight like knights still. But everything about their presence signals a body being consumed from beneath its own armor, one that has not stopped fighting despite that consumption. The Shadow Realm carries its own deep, layered relationship with rot, one distinct from the corruption seen across the main continent, tied instead to a much older lineage of decay that predates the more familiar affliction most players first encounter through Caelid and its scarlet rot. Exactly how these particular knights came to carry that older strain, and exactly what allegiance or duty they were serving before it consumed them, is something the game leaves largely for you to infer from where they stand and how deliberately they continue standing there. What is clear is the shape of what happened to them, soldiers who kept their post and their discipline even as the very substance meant to kill them became the last thing genuinely holding their bodies together. There is something particularly unsettling about a knight who does not break formation even as they visibly decay, a discipline so complete it outlasts the body's own ability to stay intact. Whatever oath or command originally placed them where they stand, it appears to have survived considerably longer than anything else about them did. The wider Shadow Realm carries rot as one of its defining features, not as a foreign invader the way it often feels in Caelid, but as something closer to native, something that seems to have been growing quietly in this hidden land for far longer than the scarlet rot most players meet first. We already know, from a story that unfolds elsewhere across the same realm, that one Empyrean's entire life was shaped by trying to hold a version of that rot at bay in someone he loved, and that his path eventually crossed with figures devoted less to curing rot than to understanding it, even embracing what it could offer. It is not a stretch to imagine soldiers stationed in this territory being caught somewhere in that same current, ordered to hold ground in a place where the affliction itself was simply part of the air, until holding ground and being slowly consumed by it stopped being two separate things. What makes the Putrescence Knights specifically difficult to watch is the contrast between their bearing and their condition. They do not stagger. They do not seem confused or diminished in the way a rotting body usually implies. They fight with the same precision any other armored knight in this world would use, which means whatever discipline shaped them in life is still running the body now, even with so much of that body already gone. It is easier, in a strange way, to make peace with a monster that has clearly stopped being anything close to a person. It is much harder to make peace with one that is still, unmistakably following orders. Their weeping armor also puts a physical shape on something this entire world keeps circling back to, that rot in the lands between is rarely just illness. It is very often what devotion looks like once the thing it was devoted to has already been lost, still moving through the motions of a purpose that no longer entirely makes sense, decaying in real time while refusing, on some level, to stop. Their weapons carry the same corruption their armor does, blades that seem to weep the same thick, dark fluid seeping from the joints of their plate, so that every swing carries a faint trail of rot with it, blooming briefly in the air before dispersing. Fighting one at close range means fighting inside a small, localized cloud of exactly the substance that is killing them, which makes every exchange feel less like a duel and more like standing too near a wound that never properly closed. There is nothing dramatic about how they finally fall either. They simply stop, the way anything eventually stops when there is no longer enough of it left standing to keep going. Watch the way they carry themselves, and you notice something else, a stiffness in the joints that reads less like injury and more like restraint, as though the armor itself is the only thing still holding the shape of a body together at all. Remove enough of it in the fight, and what shows underneath is closer to sludge than to flesh, held in a roughly human silhouette by discipline and metal alone, a shape kept upright entirely by habit and command rather than by anything resembling an intact skeleton anymore. It is armor doing the job a body has already, functionally, stopped being able to do. The territory they guard is worth naming directly, because it is not simply the Shadow Keep as a building. It is the wider approach to it, the roads and courtyards leading toward one of the most significant seats of power in the entire Hidden Realm. Whatever authority once commanded these knights clearly considered that approach worth defending permanently, worth committing soldiers to for however long it took, even past the point where committing them stopped being a survivable order to follow. Some commands, once given in this world, appear to simply never get formally withdrawn. The knights standing here are still, technically, waiting for one. Stay with me a little longer. We are leaving the shadow behind and going back to something far older than any of it. Before the golden age this world knows now, before an Erd tree ever rose to organize the sky, there is evidence that something else was worshipped here, something with scales rather than grace. That evidence still moves in caves and forgotten shrines scattered across the map in the shape of the Man-Serpents. They stand upright, human in posture, but their heads are unmistakably serpentine, elongated, scaled, eyes set in a way no human face would allow. Some fight with blades, others cast sorceries or breathe corrosive venom, and all of them move with a kind of ceremonial patience, as though combat with an intruder is closer to ritual than survival. They are rarely found wandering. They are found guarding, standing over old altars and sealed passages, tending to something the rest of the world moved past a long time ago. The clearest confirmation that this worship was once a genuine threat to the order we know now comes from a single weapon, a great spear called the Serpent Hunter, described plainly as a weapon crafted for the specific purpose of killing serpents, wielded historically by warriors whose entire calling was hunting this exact kind of god. A weapon does not get built for a purpose that does not exist. Somewhere in this world's deeper past, serpents, and whatever worshipped them, were dangerous enough and present enough that an entire warrior tradition organized itself around ending them. That old serpent worship never fully disappeared, even after the Erd Tree rose and pushed every older religion into its shadow, the same way it did to the draconic worship of the Crucible Age before it. One of Marika's own sons found his way back to it. Rykard grew to despise the Golden Order's central promise, the idea that death was never truly final, that failure simply returned you to the cycle to be corrected and reborn under the same rules that had already failed you once. He wanted an ending that actually ended something, a hunger capable of consuming a soul completely rather than politely recycling it, and he found what he was looking for in the old serpent religion the Order had buried. He did not simply worship it, he became it, fusing his own body with the very thing his mother's faith had spent an age trying to erase, transforming into something closer to a god of pure consuming appetite than to any demigod the Golden Order would have recognized as its own. The Man-Serpents scattered across the map are very likely what remains of the congregation that made that transformation possible, priests and devotees of a faith old enough to predate the tree itself, still tending altars to a god the official history insists was never really there. Whatever else they were never simple monsters standing in your way. They are the last visible evidence of a religion the world above ground worked very hard to make people forget had ever existed at all. Their shrines are worth pausing on for their own sake. Small, deliberate spaces cut into cave walls, arranged around altars that predate almost every other piece of architecture you find near them. There is a care to the construction that pure hostility would not bother with. Whoever built these spaces was not simply hiding. They were maintaining something, tending it the way any devoted community tends the place it considers sacred, and the man-serpents standing guard over that space now are doing exactly what devoted guardians in this world always seem to do, continuing a duty long after the wider world stopped remembering there was anything here worth guarding at all. There is a broader pattern worth naming here too, one that connects the serpent worship directly to some of the very oldest civilizations buried furthest beneath the surface. The eternal cities deep underground carry their own serpent and dragon imagery worked into their architecture, coiled shapes worshipped by peoples who existed long before Marika's ascension reorganized the world's entire spiritual hierarchy. Draconic worship, serpent worship, older cults built around scale and coil, rather than gold and grace, all of it seems to belong to the same deep layer of this world's history, a layer the Golden Age was built directly on top of and never fully finished burying. The man-serpents are not an isolated oddity. They are one more surviving thread of a much older, much larger religious world. The Erd tree simply grew tall enough to cast permanently into shadow. Their combat style carries a strange, formal quality that separates them from almost every other hostile creature in this world. Some wield curved blades with an unhurried, almost ceremonial precision. Others plant themselves and cast slow, deliberate sorceries, spitting corrosive venom or summoning coiling projectiles that move with a serpent's own patient, winding motion rather than a straight, aggressive line. Fighting one rarely feels frantic the way most encounters in this world do. It feels closer to being tested, evaluated by something that has clearly done this exact thing many times before and sees no particular reason to hurry through it now. There is something quietly instructive in how completely this old faith was written out of the world's official memory, despite leaving this much physical evidence of itself scattered across the map. A whole warrior tradition built specifically to hunt serpents, a whole religious order still guarding shrines to one, a demigod who abandoned everything the Golden Order offered him specifically to rejoin it. None of that reads like a minor, forgettable footnote. It reads like a genuine rival faith that the Golden Age simply never bothered mentioning again once it had won, which is in its own way the most efficient kind of erasure there is. Not denial, just silence, applied consistently for long enough that silence starts to look like something that was always true. It is worth remembering, too, that Rykard's own transformation did not happen in isolation. He needed the old faith to already exist somewhere he could return to it, priests who had kept the practice alive across however many generations the Golden Order had spent trying to make everyone forget it. Without the man-serpents and whatever congregation they represent, there may have been no serpent religion left intact enough for a disillusioned demigod to rejoin at all. In a strange way, their quiet, centuries-long persistence in the dark is the entire reason his rebellion against the order that birthed him was even possible in the first place. Let your breathing find its rhythm again. There is one more kind of surrender waiting below. Everything we have covered tonight about rot has been about resistance, bodies fighting an affliction they never asked for, decaying anyway, despite every effort to hold the line. The Kindred of Rot are the exception, and that exception is exactly what makes them so unsettling. They move low and fast, insectoid, segmented, their bodies studded with the same fleshy flowering growths seen wherever scarlet rot has fully bloomed. They appear in clusters near rot-corrupted swamps, and the sealed vessels sometimes called seedbed curses, crawling with an eagerness that reads less like sickness and more like appetite. Where other creatures in tonight's telling were consumed by rot against their will, item descriptions attached to weapons named for the kindred describe something different entirely, beings who did not fight the affliction when it came for them. They welcomed it. That single distinction changes everything about how to understand them. We have already spent an entire telling elsewhere on a woman who carried this exact same affliction her whole life and fought it with everything she had, refusing to let it define her even as it slowly claimed her body regardless. The Kindred of Rot represent the opposite choice, the same corruption, met not with resistance but with total, willing surrender. From the outside, that surrender looks monstrous. From whatever remains on the inside of something that used to be a person, it may have felt like relief, an end to the exhausting work of holding a losing line, replaced by something that simply let the rot finish what it started and become, instead of an enemy, a new kind of self. The game does not tell us whether that surrender was actually freedom or simply the last stage of a slower defeat wearing a different name. It rarely resolves questions like that cleanly, and this one, more than most, resists a comfortable answer either way. What is left for us is only the shape of the choice itself, and the uncomfortable possibility that giving in here might have hurt less than holding on ever did. They rarely appear alone, moving instead in small clusters that seem to coordinate without any visible signal passing between them, converging on an intruder from several directions at once, the way a single organism might close a fist. Watching a group of them move together, you start to notice that whatever individuality they might once have carried as separate people seems to have dissolved into something closer to a single, distributed body, still technically several creatures, behaving as one. There is one particular figure whose story sits closely beside this chapter without belonging to it directly, a woman quietly carrying the same rot afflicting her own sisters, each of whom chose a different way to meet it. Some of them let it take them completely, becoming exactly the kind of creature we are describing here. She instead spends her own journey deciding piece by piece what she is willing to let the rot cost her and what she refuses to give up regardless of what it takes from her body along the way. Her story does not resolve the question the Kindred of Rot raised so much as it sits right beside it, offering a version of the same affliction met with neither full resistance nor full surrender, but something more complicated and more human than either extreme. The vessels found, scattered near their territory, sometimes called seedbed curses, are worth a moment of their own, too, sealed containers that seem to exist for the specific purpose of cultivating rot deliberately, rather than simply suffering it as an accident of exposure. Someone, at some point, was actively growing this affliction on purpose, tending it with the same careful attention a gardener might give something they were proud of, rather than fighting it as a disease that needed to be contained. That detail alone reframes the entire chapter. This was never simply corruption, spreading unchecked through unlucky bodies. Somewhere behind it, however far back in the history the game lets us see, someone chose to cultivate this and called it, in their own eyes, a kind of gift worth passing on. Their appearance carries a strange, almost floral quality once you actually look closely rather than simply fighting on instinct, blooms of pale, fleshy growth breaking through segmented insectoid plating, less like a wound and more like something being grown deliberately in the exact places a body would otherwise be most vulnerable. It is difficult to tell, looking at one, where the original creature ends and the rot's own contribution begins, and that difficulty might be the entire point. At a certain stage of surrender, the affliction stops being a separate thing happening to a body and simply becomes the body's new, ongoing shape. There is more waiting below. Let your shoulders release a little further. Scattered across the lands between, in graveyards, near old battlefields, and standing watch over the remembrances left behind by the world's greatest fallen figures, there are tall, skeletal creatures with the heads of birds, twin curved blades held ready, waiting with a patience that never once looks like boredom. Their armor carries a specific name in the game's own text, Deathrite armor, and the phrase alone tells you most of what you need to know. These are not random scavengers drawn to corpses. They are something closer to attendants, positioned deliberately near the remains and memories of the significant dead, as though some older tradition assigned them the job of watching over exactly this kind of place and never rescinded the order. When they notice you, a low, resonant bell tone rings out, less like a monster's roar and more like something out of an actual funeral rite, a sound built for mourning rather than for battle. This world has an entire cosmology built around death as an active force rather than a simple ending. There is a rune of death that was once sealed away, specifically because unleashing it broke the natural order everyone had assumed was permanent. A moment when true, final death first entered a world that had, until then, always found a way to bring its dead back. Once that seal broke, death stopped being something anyone in this world could take for granted, and it is not hard to imagine an order forming afterward whose entire purpose was managing what that change actually meant, gathering the remembrances of the fallen great, standing guard over the places where death had properly permanently landed for the first time. Whether the Deathbirds are the literal descendants of any such order, or simply creatures that gravitated instinctively toward the specific weight death leaves behind wherever it settles, the game does not spell out directly. What it gives us instead is behavior, patient, ritualistic, entirely undistracted by anything except the specific deed they have been left to watch. In a world this violent, that kind of focused, ceremonial stillness feels like its own kind of horror, proof that even death here has its own quiet bureaucracy and its own patient attendants, waiting exactly where they were told to wait. Their fighting style reinforces that same funerary quality once combat actually begins. Twin curved blades move in wide, sweeping arcs, more like a rite being performed than a battle being fought, footwork slow and deliberate right up until the exact moment it needs to be fast. A heavy feathered cloak trails behind them through the motion, and combined with the low bell tone announcing their attention, the entire encounter carries an unmistakable weight of ceremony, as though you have not so much been attacked as you have been formally noticed by something that has been doing the same duty for longer than most of this world's kingdoms have existed. They tend to appear specifically where a demigod or a figure of genuine historical weight has fallen, standing over the remembrance left behind the way a mourner might stand over a grave, guarding a memory rather than a body. That placement, tied so precisely to significant death rather than death in general, suggests they are not simply drawn to corpses the way a scavenger would be. They are drawn to the specific, heavy kind of death that reshapes the world around it. The kind this story has already shown us breaks something structural whenever it happens. Wherever that particular weight has settled, a deathbird sooner or later seems to find its way there to keep watch. There is something worth noticing in how rarely they actually attack first. More often than not, you feel their presence before you provoke it, the low bell, the sense of being watched from somewhere just out of sight, a patience that waits to see whether you intend to disturb what they are guarding before committing to violence at all. That restraint is almost more unnerving than aggression would be. It suggests a kind of judgment being made about you specifically, a decision about whether you count, in this particular moment, as a mourner passing through respectfully, or as one more intrusion to be removed. Most of tonight's creatures react. The Deathbirds appear to actually consider. Their skeletal build deserves its own moment too, because so little of it is actually hidden the way a normal body's structure would be. Ribs, joints, the long architecture of the neck, all of it visible beneath a thin covering of feather and cloth. Less a body wearing bones, and more bones wearing the barest suggestion of a body. It reads, less like death has been inflicted on them, and more like death is simply what they are made of, structurally from the very beginning. Feathers and ceremony draped over an armature that was never anything but bare architecture to begin with. One more before we rest properly. This last one is not about a body at all. It is about what happens when a mind stops being allowed to stay one thing. Deep in the tunnels beneath Volcano Manor, and further south in places most players never think to visit, There are figures whose faces have been replaced entirely by fire, a single restless flame where a nose, a mouth, a pair of eyes should be. They do not speak, they do not need to. Whatever used to make them individual people appears to have already burned away. This is the visible mark of the frenzied flame, one of this world's outer gods, and arguably the most directly hostile to the idea of an individual self. Where other outer gods promise power, or rot, or a private, comforting sleep, the frenzied flame's whispered promise is closer to unity through erasure, the dissolving of every boundary between one mind and the next, until everything touched by it becomes, in some sense, the same burning thing. The chant associated with its followers is remembered in fragments, pleas for minds to be split and multiplied and finally joined back together as one, which sounds almost peaceful, stated plainly, and reads as something closer to violence once you have actually watched what it does to the people it touches. We see the early stages of that touch in characters who are still, technically, themselves, women and men whose eyes begin burning faintly before anything else about them changes, drawn helplessly toward the flame, the way a moth is drawn toward something that will kill it. The faceless servants in the tunnels are almost certainly what those early stages look like once they finish running their course, the individual burned away completely, replaced by something that serves the flame directly and nothing else. There is a keeper of this flame too, a colossal burning presence, bound and restrained specifically because what it carries is considered too dangerous to ever be released freely into the world, a containment effort that tells you plainly how seriously even the Golden Order takes the threat of a fire that does not simply destroy bodies, but erases the very idea of having one distinct mind to lose in the first place. There is something almost gentle in how the game frames the people caught early in this process, never cruel about their fate, only sad, watching someone lose the edges of themselves a little at a time until there is nothing left to hold the shape of a person apart from anyone else nearby. By the time you meet the faceless servants themselves, that process is long finished. What is left does not remember being anyone in particular, because being anyone in particular was the exact thing the flame was designed to take from them. Combat with them carries almost none of the ritual patience we saw in some of tonight's other creatures. They come at you erratically, arms swinging wide, movement closer to a burning thing thrashing than to anything trained or deliberate, which somehow makes them worse rather than easier to face. There is no discipline left to read here, no order underneath the violence the way there was with the rotting knights or the serpent priests. Just heat and momentum and whatever remains of a nervous system still capable of closing distance. The keeper of this flame waits far beneath the earth, chained deliberately in place, a containment effort massive enough to tell you exactly how much this world fears what would happen if that binding ever failed completely. Should it fail, the game shows us plainly what follows, an ending in which the entire world is finally, completely unmade by the same fire currently only touching these isolated, faceless few, every remaining boundary between every remaining person burned away at once. The small, private erasures we see here made total and permanent across everyone, left standing in the lands between. What you are looking at in these tunnels is not the full horror of the frenzied flame. It is only the smallest, most contained preview of what total unity through total erasure would actually look like, scaled down to a handful of bodies, specifically so the rest of the world never has to find out what the full version costs. There is a specific cruelty in how gently this affliction is allowed to begin. It does not announce itself as violence. It arrives instead as a kind of relief, a promise that the exhausting work of being one separate, struggling person can finally stop, that every private grief could simply dissolve into something larger and warmer than any single mind could hold alone. That promise is genuinely, seductively kind sounding, right up until you see what actually remains when someone has taken it fully at its word. The faceless servants were not tricked into something they hated. On some level, however briefly, they were offered exactly what they wanted. That is the part of this chapter that should stay with you the longest. Consider for a moment how much of what makes a person recognizably themselves depends entirely on the boundary between their mind and everyone else's, the private thoughts nobody else has access to, the specific griefs and joys that belong only to you and no one else. The Frenzied Flame's entire promise is the removal of exactly that boundary, framed not as loss, but as relief, an end to the specific loneliness of being permanently, unavoidably separate from every other mind around you. That the removal of loneliness and the removal of selfhood turn out, in this particular telling, to be functionally the same event is maybe the single most unsettling idea buried anywhere in tonight's entire telling. You're almost through. Let everything get heavier now. There are two more waiting, both far older than anything we have covered so far. Deep beneath the surface, in the ruined, root-choked civilization of Nokron and the quiet forest paths of Ansel River, enormous translucent shapes drift through the dark, glowing faintly blue, moving with a slow, dreamlike grace, entirely unlike anything else found underground. An elk the size of a small building, a ram with horns wide enough to fill a corridor, a wolf that seems to walk slightly above the ground rather than on it. These are the Ancestor spirits, and unlike almost everything else we have discussed tonight, they were never really people to begin with. They are something closer to memory given shape, the lingering imprint of animals, a much older civilization once considered sacred enough to worship. Long before the Erdtree rose and reorganized the spiritual life of the entire surface world, the people who built the ruined city beneath it followed a different kind of faith, one centered on ancestry, animal spirits, and a reverence for the dead that had nothing to do with grace or golden trees at all. Their architecture still stands down there, eerie and half-collapsed, arranged around the enormous glowing figures that seem to be the closest thing that civilization ever had to living gods. Whether the ancestor spirits are literal ghosts of animals that once lived, or something more abstract, an accumulated concentration of belief itself, given enough form to finally be seen, is one of the many things this world leaves entirely open. What makes them unsettling has very little to do with aggression. They do not stalk you the way most of tonight's creatures do. They simply exist, massive, silent, luminous, moving through ruins that have been empty for what was very likely centuries, guarding a memory that outlived every single person who once held it. When they do turn hostile, the transition feels less like a monster attacking and more like a memorial defending itself, ancient grief given just enough physical form to finally push back against whoever disturbs it. There is a specific, smaller variant worth knowing about too, an ancestor spirit bonded so completely to the fading remnant of a person that the two have become almost impossible to separate. The animal spirit is in the last echo of someone's ancestry fused into a single grieving shape. It is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that these creatures are not simply decorative ruins brought to life. They are what happens when devotion to the dead is allowed to accumulate for long enough without ever being allowed to fully let go, glowing quietly in the dark, waiting for people who are never coming back to visit them again. There is a quiet grandeur to the ruins surrounding them that separates this chapter from almost everything else we have covered tonight. This was not a broken kingdom or a suppressed cult clinging to relevance underground. It was, by every visible sign, a genuinely advanced and deeply spiritual civilization with its own architecture, its own burial customs, its own careful reverence for whatever came before it. The Erdtree's rise did not simply defeat this culture in open conflict the way it did with some of tonight's other suppressed faiths. It appears to have buried it, literally, beneath the very roots that would eventually cradle an entirely different religion above, so that an ordinary traveler walking the surface world today would have no reason to ever suspect that any of this once existed at all. The ancestor spirits are what happens when an entire civilization's memory survives its civilization by a very long time, drifting through empty halls that used to be full, guarding sanctity for a species of worshippers that no longer exist to be grateful for the guarding. Their light is worth mentioning on its own, a soft, cold blue that has no clear source anywhere on their translucent bodies, simply present the way moonlight is present without needing a visible flame to explain it. Every other source of illumination in this world's underground spaces tends to come from something burning or something rotting, fire or corruption, heat or decay. The ancestor spirits are neither. They glow the way a memory glows when you close your eyes and it is still somehow there, present without any physical mechanism you could point to and call the cause. Rest for a moment. One more waits above ground, tied to a massacre this telling already mentioned once tonight without fully explaining it. Earlier tonight, we spoke of a village burned to the ground, its people strung from bridges, ordered destroyed by a supposedly all-knowing hermit over half of a medallion. The ones who actually carried out that massacre were his depraved perfumers, and it is worth finally looking directly at what that title actually means. They appear as hunched, robed figures, their faces obscured beneath heavy hoods, an elongated, nose-like proboscis protruding from where a face should be visible. They move with an unnerving, stooped patience, mixing volatile concoctions as they approach, throwing flasks of corrosive perfume that burn on contact, poison the air, or detonate outright depending on what particular blend they have prepared. Their entire identity is built around scent and chemistry twisted into a weapon. Expertise that should belong to something delicate and careful, repurposed entirely for violence. Perfumery, as a craft, is fundamentally about extraction and refinement, taking something raw and turning it into something concentrated and precise. The perfumers we meet have simply applied that same careful, exacting process to poison, to fire, to whatever volatile substance serves their purpose best in a given moment. There is something particularly disturbing about violence delivered with that kind of fussy, deliberate craftsmanship, the same patience you would expect from someone perfecting a delicate fragrance, spent instead perfecting the most efficient way to burn a person alive. Their association with Volcano Manor tells you plenty about who they actually serve. That manor exists as a place of curated cruelty, where a demigod invites the powerful and the greedy inside under the pretense of hospitality, only to have them quietly eliminated once they have outlived their usefulness. The perfumers are the manor's cleanup staff in the most literal sense, the ones who do the actual dissolving, burning, and disposing once the manor's true business has concluded. Gentility and horror share the same household here, and the perfumers are the exact point where those two things meet without any contradiction at all. Some of them are described as blessed, larger, more volatile variants who seem to have leaned even further into whatever twisted mastery the ordinary perfumers were already practicing. What exactly earns that blessing, and from whom, the game never quite says, though the pattern by now should feel familiar. Devotion, however grotesque its expression, tends to be rewarded in this world with more power to keep expressing it. The massacre of an entire innocent village was by every indication simply one assignment among many for people who had already spent who knows how long refining exactly this kind of work into a craft they took genuine, careful pride in. What makes the perfumers land differently than most of tonight's other creatures is how little transformation is actually involved in their horror. They were not cursed. They were not corrupted by an outer god or consumed by rot they never asked for. Whatever they are beneath the hood and the robe, the game gives us no strong reason to believe it is anything other than an ordinary person who chose this work, trained for it, and kept choosing it, assignment after assignment, until the choosing itself stopped feeling like a choice at all. Most of tonight's horror came from something being taken away from someone. This one, uncomfortably, seems closer to something being built, deliberately, one careful decision at a time. There is a broader question worth sitting with as we leave this chapter behind, one that reaches back across almost everything we have covered tonight. So much of this world's horror comes from people who were changed against their will, twisted by rot, by curses, by gods reaching in from outside the world and rearranging what a body was allowed to be. The perfumers offer the uncomfortable counter-example: ordinary, unafflicted, entirely willing participants in the machinery of cruelty, proof that this world's worst outcomes never actually required a curse to begin with. Sometimes, evidently, all that was ever required was employment, and enough time spent getting good at the job. You're almost through. Let everything get heavier now. What remains is only the quiet after all of this. 14 creatures, and every one of them got this way because of something. Not randomness, not simple monster of the week design dropped in to fill space. A cursed royal line, rotting from the inside out, because dying somewhere on a road was preferable to living under a rule that would not have them. A star the universe itself did not want, following the same doomed arc from birth to slow, withered death that a much smaller insect follows in miniature down in the sand. Priests left behind so completely that the roots meant to carry their souls toward rebirth but poisoned them instead. A whole people built by human hands, hated specifically for the hands that built them, given one single hopeful ending after generations of nothing but harm. Believers who wear their devotion as actual skin, hands crawling alone in the dark, echoing something sacred gone terribly wrong. Guardians rotting at their post because nobody ever told them the thing they were guarding was already gone. Knights so disciplined they kept formation, even as rot dissolved them from the inside. A congregation still tending an altar to a god the world above ground insists was never real. Creatures who met the same affliction another woman spent her whole life fighting and simply let it win, because winning and losing had stopped meaning anything different to them by the end. Attendants standing watch over death itself, patient in a way nothing violent should ever be allowed to look. And a fire that does not kill you so much as it erases the specific shape of you, leaving something that still moves, still serves, and no longer remembers what it was serving for. Enormous, glowing memories of animals, a whole civilization, once knelt to, still standing guard over devotion no living person remembers giving. And careful, patient hands, trained to perfect a fragrance, turned instead toward perfecting the most efficient way to make a village disappear. Every one of these things was a tragedy first, and a monster only after that. That is, more than anything else, the actual signature of this world's horror. It rarely reaches for evil for its own sake. It reaches for grief, for abandonment, for devotion that outlived whatever it was devoted to, and lets those things curdle slowly into something with claws. If there is a single thread running underneath everything we walked through tonight, it might be this. Almost none of it happened to something that started out as a monster. It happened to someone, a noble, a priest, a soldier, a scholar, a devotee, a mind that was, at some earlier point, simply trying to survive whatever enormous system it found itself born inside of. The transformation came after. The transformation was never really the point. It was only the visible residue of something much older and much sadder happening underneath, slowly, over a very long time, largely unnoticed by anyone with the power to stop it. That is worth carrying gently If you carry anything from tonight at all, not fear exactly, something closer to tenderness, extended toward things that mostly only ever receive violence. Every creature we sat with tonight was once someone standing at the very beginning of a story no one warned them was going to end this way. Somewhere tonight, in the fiction of this world, and in the much larger world outside it, something is still quietly enduring what was done to it, still fighting, or still surrendered, or still simply standing at its post because no one ever told it that it could finally stop. There is no tidy lesson meant to close a telling like this one. There is only the noticing itself, and whatever small, quiet kindness that noticing might leave behind in you, carried forward into tomorrow, long after the details of any single creature we sat with tonight have already begun to soften and blur. You do not have to remember all of it. You do not have to remember any of it in order for tonight to have done its job. The room around you is quiet. Whatever you were carrying when this started, you can set it down now. The lands between is still out there, still beautiful, still full of things that used to be people. It will still be there tomorrow if you ever want to go back. For tonight, that is enough. Rest now. You're safe here. Sleep.